Hello, and welcome to In Pursuit of Truth and Happiness, in Reconciliation of Faith and Reason, the beginning. Last episode, I concluded my analysis of Homer's great works, the Iliad and the Odyssey. In analyzing these two great epic poems, I broke down what Homer has to teach us regarding the philosophy and tragedy of war. Greek thinkers and historical figures that follow in the centuries after Homer may believe his work to be exaggerated, but it is beyond doubt all were influenced by Homer in some way. So much so that in history, we may not see a literal attempt to recreate the Trojan War, but because of Homer's capturing of the philosophy of war, we see how every war in history is in some way a recreation, or rather, a reincarnation of the Trojan War. Now, I will turn my attention to another great Greek thinker whose influence is just as far reaching in time and space, more maybe, Plato. It is my intention to cover all of the works of Plato with the goal of capturing the essence and first principles of Platonic philosophy. This by itself is an enormous project that will take me some time to complete, but my intention is to present a full portrait of Platonic philosophy and to also analyze, after covering the works of Plato, the works of Aristotle. My motivation is to present a portrait of both Platonic philosophy and Aristotelianism as two bodies of complementary thought, embodying human reason's understanding of the universe in all of its limitations, as far as Plato and Aristotle are concerned at least. After covering Aristotle's works, I will move on to cover the entirety of the Old and New Testaments. My intention is to create a dialogue between the three authors that stand behind each of these bodies of thought and to present how they do, yes, retain their differences, but how they also share a dynamic relationship that, when seen with the mind's eye, is underpinned by a growth of the human mind in wisdom and understanding. Each body of thought, it will be seen, complements and helps the previous body of thought grow by not only illuminating what was concluded, even if incorrectly, but also picking up where one body of thought ends and taking the path of truth and happiness to higher levels than we ever thought possible. It is in the modern day world, for the last 500 years, that rationality and faith are at odds more than ever they were in the past, as seen allegorically in Greek philosophy and biblical theology. My intention, in that of this podcast, is not only to show how rationality and faith are not only complementary, but essentially made for each other. After covering the Bible in its entirety, I will move on to covering the body of thought that best preserves this unity of rationality and faith in our world today, while also exploring bodies of thought that claim to do the same, but really do so with both in opposition to each other. Consequently, I have no intention of leaving the books I have covered and will cover behind in favor of whatever book I cover next. The idea that informs this podcast is to consistently cite these books and cross-reference with each other in an attempt to narrow down an objective understanding of truth that both transcends time and space while being truly present in the temporal, not just in the past, but the present and future. For example, I will at some point cross reference Plato's Republic, Plato's Laws, with St. Augustine's City of God, and Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, with an eye toward what informs a truly perfect society, as well as what truly causes the fall of civilizations. In another episode, I will eventually cross reference Plato's Euthyphro with Mosaic law in the books of Exodus and Leviticus, and Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. These are but two examples of what I aim to accomplish down the line, but I must first begin by analyzing these books by themselves before engaging them together in a philosophical dialogue. With that said, I will now turn my attention to the first work of Plato that I will be covering, Republic. Yet before I can do this, I must explain two things. Firstly, my method of analyzing the works of Plato, as opposed to my method of analysis used for Homer. Secondly, the relationship between Plato and his teacher and main character of most of his works, Socrates. Regarding my methodology for analyzing Republic, I am taking a different approach than from my approach to Homer. For Homer's works, I analyzed the books by analyzing each character and what arguments they represent. From there, I constructed an allegorical dialogue set up by Homer between the characters of the book while attempting to find out which character or characters belong to Homer. I could do this for Republic, as Republic, along with all Plato's works, is a dialogue. However, I decided to break down the arguments of Republic book by book. I will pause my narrative here and point out a possible point of confusion. In the classical world, in works such as Republic or St. Augustine's City of God, books are going to be what we in the 21st century now think of as chapters. For example, Republic, a single word, is made up of 10, quote, books or 10, quote, chapters. City of God is made up of 22, quote, books or 22, quote, chapters. For the sake of continuity with these works, I will say book instead of chapter. With that digression settled, I will, instead of breaking down the arguments each character represents, instead demonstrate the argument of Plato's Republic as it unfolds in its multidimensional reality gradually from Book 1 to Book 10. In this way, I will draw conclusions based on the dialogue that are present in those books and cross-reference them with what conclusions I will draw as I dive deeper into Republic. By Book 10, I will synthesize these conclusions into an overall analysis of Plato's Republic. Regarding Plato's works, we must make two notes. First, Plato's dialogues are not transcripts for real conversations that took place, but are philosophized versions of real conversations that almost certainly took place between people who are truly historical figures. Secondly, the main character of most of Plato's dialogues is his famous teacher, Socrates. What makes Socrates interesting is not just this fact alone of him being the main character of most of Plato's dialogues, but the fact that Socrates did not write anything down. Socrates' students and opponents wrote about him, but the man himself wrote nothing down. Thus, when we encounter Socrates, we encounter someone's understanding of who Socrates was. In the case of Republic, we encounter Plato's understanding of Socrates. Consequently, it is difficult to separate Plato from Socrates in terms of what they both believe. Thus, as I move forward, I will use their names interchangeably to represent the same argument. This will not be the last time we encounter this problem in history. We will encounter this problem again, the problem of an important teacher not writing down what they taught, but their students writing everything down, as well as their opponents in Jesus Christ. There are quite a few similarities I will eventually draw out between Jesus and Socrates at a future date. As a side note, I must say that when it comes to speaking of Jesus Christ, we can speak of him in two ways. And in this podcast, he will be spoken of in both ways as we encounter him in literature, in what is written afterwards. Firstly, we can speak of Jesus as a historical figure in man who was born at a certain time and died at a certain time. He was a great man in many different ways that left an impression on a group of followers that he accumulated during his earthly life. Jesus, like Socrates, wrote nothing. Jesus' apostles and disciples wrote everything, as did his opponents. The comparisons between Jesus and Socrates do not stop there, but I will save these comparisons for when we encounter them. The second way we can speak of Jesus is in his divinity. Whether this divinity renders Christ as God or as a divinely created being will be a topic of discussion when we encounter the theological disputes in the generations that succeeded the historical death of Christ. In my comparison of Christ to Socrates and how they did not write anything, I refer to the first way of speaking of Christ as a historical figure. Whatever the true Socrates was like, it is beyond doubt that Plato uses Socrates as his mouthpiece in his dialogues. So, if we are to understand Plato, we must understand Socrates as portrayed in Plato's dialogues. From here, we will have to consider two more things before diving into Republic. What the opponents of Socrates have to say about Socrates, and the exact nature of a philosophical dialogue like Republic. The former point will be discussed in a future podcast, especially when we cover the apology of Socrates and the opposition to Socrates as seen in the works of Aristophanes. The latter point helps us as readers better understand how to read a philosophical dialogue. However, since understanding how to read a philosophical dialogue serves as a great segue into the dialogue of Plato's Republic, I will consequently treat this in the next episode. For now, I will conclude my introduction to Platonic philosophy and the projection of my podcast. In the next episode, I will discuss the nature and limitations of a philosophical dialogue, as well as diving into the first 4 books of Republic. Thank you for listening to this episode of In Pursuit of Truth and Happiness.